Okay, that is it in terms of the house rules. And so I start with introducing the first speaker, which will be Stephen Okey. He's an associate professor of theology at San Leo University. I actually had to look up where that is. I found the homepage. It says it's one of the top-ranked universities in Florida. So here we go. You're teaching courses in theology and ethics there. Stephen has earned his master's degree in theology from the University of Chicago Divinity School and his PhD in systematic theology from Boston College. He's a contributor and podcast host at Daily Theology, which is a collaborative Catholic theology blog. And it's also said somewhere that you're an avid hiker, twice walked the Camino de Santiago, which is nice. But maybe more important is, or at least as important is, that you're the author of a book called Theology of Conversation, an Introduction to David Tracy, highly recommendable. And you're currently working on a book on public theology in a digital age. So the title of your presentation is Cancelled into the Outer Darkness, Accountability and Intersection of Public and Digital Theologies. If the title has not changed, we do not know, but we will find out in a second. Okay, Stephen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And I have some slides I will share. Sorry, just a second. So no, the title did not change yet. We'll see. So I did not want annotate. So good morning, afternoon, evening, late evening to everyone. Thanks for joining. The fuller draft of this is available online, and I did write a bit longer than I intended. So in presenting today, I'll be summarizing some of the lengthier sections. I like to open by considering briefly the parable of the wedding feast in from Matthew 22, in which Jesus tells the story of a wedding feast where, after a couple rounds of refusal of invitations, one of the people who is brought in is unsuitably dressed. He is cast into the outer darkness, as the King James translation tells us. I open here because I think the parable gives a helpful lens into how some currents in the United States think about a phenomenon called cancel culture. Someone, either for some transgression, however ambiguous, or perhaps because of having the wrong ideas, is summarily cast out or canceled, and their lives are over. The apocalyptic character of the parable fits with the end of the world sense that some use to talk about cancel culture. What I'm interested in with the question of cancel culture is twofold. How does it fit within the context of digital culture and digital theology? And what then does it mean for public theology in a digital context? To get to these questions, I open first by trying to define cancel culture. And next, I pull on our colleague Catherine Schmidt's book, Virtual Communion, to draw connections between the particularities of cancel culture and wider internet culture. And finally, I work with David Tracy's approach to public theology to offer some possible interventions for further reflection. Ultimately, theology offers valuable tools in terms of justice and charity, the preferential option for the poor, and practices of reconciliation for thinking with the contemporary challenge of cancel culture. So, use of the term cancel culture is widespread, but often unclear in contemporary US discourse. It's sometimes good or bad, depending on who is doing the canceling and who is being canceled. And also whether it's about punishing people for actual offenses or about silencing people we just don't like. These divergences undermine its analytical utility, but it remains a widely used term, and it does reflect some patterns in discourse, and thus I think it must be dealt with. Journalist Asia Romano has traced the history of the term cancel to the 1991 film New Jack City, but notes its contemporary use followed a 2014 episode of Love and Hip Hop New York, where amid a couple's fight, one person said to the other, "You're canceled." It became popular online afterwards, usually as a joke between friends, until the term became more mainstream in 2019 during the second half of Donald Trump's presidency. And conceptually, canceling has been linked to the use of boycotts during the civil rights movement and to the more recent Me Too movement. In light of divergences around the term, Pew Research did a survey on cancel culture in September of 2020. They found that a little less than half of Americans had heard a fair amount or great deal about cancel culture. These respondents were then asked to provide their own description of what it means, and nearly half gave answers that focused on the idea of accountability. The next two largest groups of answers described it in terms of censorship of speech or history, or mean-spirited actions taken to cause others harm. Among those who considered accountability as the central meaning, there was a split over whether cancellation was more likely to lead to genuine accountability or to punish people who didn't deserve it. So while accountability seems to be the primary frame for thinking about cancel culture, there have been concerns about both limiting public discussion and about who are targeted for cancellation. The Romano cites Black feminist Loretta Ross's critique that cancel culture is spread to areas of disagreement rather than discrimination and injustice, while also asserting that most public shaming is horizontal and targets people who are easier targets while also being less responsible for significant problems. As it is evident that a clear and concrete definition of cancel culture is contested and perhaps a bit tricky, public discourse in the US uses the term variously to describe almost any effort that uses public forums to draw attention to alleged misdeeds, ranging from violent crime to various forms of bigotry to liking or disliking the wrong things. While the emphasis on accountability dominates over censorship or outright meanness, even that focus exhibits tension over whether it is authentic accountability or unjust punishment. Indeed, part of the difficulty in working out a definition is that the term becomes something of a rhetorical cudgel, inconsistently used and often in bad faith. In light of this, my own working definition of to cancel is the practice of using widely publicly accessible forms of communication to draw attention to perceived wrongdoing in order to motivate action, bringing consequences to the alleged offender. While I would describe cancel culture as the general trend of using cancellation tactics in public discourse against a diverse set of targets for a diverse set of ends. Next, I think cancel culture seems to be a part of wider digital culture. It is a digitally mediated expression of classic social practices of accountability, ostracism, and social policing. To show how, I look to 5 key features of internet culture as discussed by Schmidt in Virtual Communion: anonymity, vitriol, authority, access, and disembodiment. So first, Schmidt describes anonymity less in terms of being nameless and more in terms of a lack of accountability. With cancel culture, anonymity is an issue in several respects. First, among those who might be canceled, there is a diverse range in terms of being publicly known and recognized or not. So there's a real difference between a Bill Cosby and a person who has like 200 Twitter followers. Second, for those potentially doing the canceling, there is sometimes real risk of demanding accountability from others, which might lead to doxing, death threats, etc. And still for others, anonymity can be used as a shield to hide behind without taking any responsibility. Second, Schmidt describes vitriol as the many ways we have found to mistreat each other in virtual space, and cancellation certainly can be vitriolic. But perhaps more importantly, the structure of online publics allows for and even encourages a decontextualization of what people have done or said online, which makes it easier to cherry pick what someone has said in order to fuel vitriol against them. Third, Schmidt notes how authority is increasingly difficult for religious or other authorities to assert online due to the explosion of potential sources thereof. With cancel culture, much of the authority question is vested in whether or not accountability is justified, whether there is some sort of due process for this, and how it connects to other practices of accountability, such as legal or civil justice. Fourth, Schmidt highlights access, both in the sense that anyone or anything can likely be instantly reached online, and that this access is unequally distributed. Regarding the first, at least, the digital world has increased access to potential targets for cancellation and made it easier to place pressure on them or those who support them. And finally, Schmidt discusses disembodiment in the sense that people often assume what happens online is less embodied and therefore less real than, quote, in real life. A similar question pertains in cancel culture, which is whether or not cancellation has any actual consequences for the canceled or for cancelers, or if it's even real to begin with. So Schmidt's 5 aspects are a helpful frame for thinking through how cancel culture is one part of the wider digital culture, particularly in light of quasi-publics like Twitter or other social media platforms. Third, I'm interested in cancel culture as a question for public theology. The discipline of public theology is shaped in part by the double entendre of the term. It is concerned both with the role of theology in public spaces, as well as theologizing about those same public spaces. I tend to focus more on the latter of these two and work with the theologian David Tracy, here pictured. He differentiates the various publics to which theologians are responsible into the academy, the church, and the wider society. It is important to note here that he sees each of these as genuine publics, each with their own defining concerns, populations, and approaches to discourse. He argues that theologians have responsibilities to these publics because theology is itself public in two key senses. One, it deals with fundamental human questions that are ubiquitous in human cultures and history. And two, theology makes arguments regarding those questions that are rooted in reason, sources, and evidence that are publicly available. Key to Tracy's understanding of public theology is that he treats theology as an essentially conversational task. Conversation is a central frame for thinking through the questions, exchanges, challenges, risks, and opportunities presented by bringing together two or more beliefs, thinkers, texts, situations, and so forth. A central part of his view of conversation is that it always involves risk. By engaging in conversation, one takes the risk of having one's views challenged, rejected, even changed through that conversation. As a result, the outcome of these exchanges is never a given. Tracy recognizes that conversations can lead anywhere from interlocutors coming to complete agreement, to a mutual understanding without changing one's views, to outright rejection, even hostility towards the other, and everywhere in between. The risk of conversation means risking any of these outcomes. This is also why Tracy argues that the best conversations are grounded in some basic commitments to mutual charity, so the other might be respected and that their ideas be given an honest hearing. While Tracy recognized that these features mark an ideal speech situation that doesn't consistently happen, they nonetheless offer an ideal towards which one ought to aspire. Thus, for Tracy, theology is fundamentally a conversation that is always already public in some degree by virtue of its focus on deep questions that are widely shared and its standards for conversation and argument that are widely accessible. Building on these basic descriptions, I contend that cancel culture is a viable topic for public theology, and I suggest, at least preliminarily, 3 theological interventions on the discourse around cancel culture. So the tension between accountability and social cohesion, how that relates to justice and charity, the problem of marginalization in conversation and how that relates to the preferential option for the poor, and finally, the reality of conversion and reconciliation. So first, as the previous sections show, there is a tension within cancel culture discourse between accountability and unjust punishment. I think this is indicative of a deeper tension around the excesses and deficiencies of accountability within a community. When efforts at accountability stray too far to one stream or the other, it can in fact lead to breakdowns in social cohesion, trust among community members, and willingness to cooperate or offer honest responses. In light of this, I think framing cancel culture in light of the virtue of justice can help resist some of the more popularly highlighted excesses, while also addressing the very deficiencies that lead to cancellation as a form of accountability. Further, Tracy's approach to conversation requires something beyond basic justice, arguing that one ought to approach their interlocutor with charity, as this is the real grounds for taking the sort of risks that authentic conversation needs. The willingness to take the risk of conversation depends precisely upon a moral and theological commitment to the other and to the search for truth in that conversation. Thus, the challenge of accountability and its role in social cohesion that is presented by cancel culture is better understood in light of theological claims about justice and charity. Second, we can see the value of the preferential option for the poor in thinking through the problems of public conversation and marginalization. A key aspect of what motivates many who pursue cancellation, when done so in good faith, is the experience of being relatively marginalized and having limited options for pursuing accountability. Indeed, regarding concerns about free speech, one can reasonably argue that power differentials have a chilling effect on the less powerful or resilient, and thus cancellation might at times offer redress to this problem and enable freer speech. This links to Tracy's own recognition that conversation must be imagined not as center and periphery, but as polycentric, recognizing and attending to the contributions of diverse groups. The preferential option is thus useful for evaluating cancellation with regard to the powerful, although it is less clear with respect to so-called horizontal cases. Finally, many have noted that cancel culture seems to suffer from any real openness to conversion or reconciliation. There is little attention to the possibility that people might change their views or reject past posts, nor is there much interest in the rehabilitation of the canceled. Tracy notes in his work on public theology that there are always ambiguities within conversation, writing, quote, "There is no innocent interpretation, no innocent interpreter, no innocent text," end quote. This is linked with his call for engaging a hermeneutics of suspicion alongside a hermeneutics of generosity, seeing both as necessary to healthy conversation. So for Tracy, one ought not to take the other simply at face value, and there is real value in thinking critically about current and past positions. But the goal is not to score points or win a debate, but to have an authentic conversation that is at least potentially revelatory of truth. In light of this, theological practices of reconciliation, such as the sacrament of penance, offer potential models for thinking about cancel culture. Penance traditionally has 4 aspects: contrition, confession, absolution, and penance. And reflection on these various stages may help with thinking about what authentic accountability means, both for the canceller and the cancelee. And I develop all 3 of these themes much more in the written version that's available online. So in conclusion, cancel culture is a contested and overwrought topic, one deeply embedded in at least the US contemporary digital culture. It is also one that brings up interesting questions for public theology. Indeed, the work of David Tracy on public theology as a form of conversation is helpful for thinking it through cancel culture in both its strong focus on accountability and its lesser concerns about the free exchange of ideas. Theology also offers helpful resources for thinking through the public challenge of cancel culture, particularly in terms of concerns about accountability, the community's responsibility to the marginalized, and the need for at least the possibility of reconciliation. Cancel culture need not have the apocalyptic imagery of the parable of the wedding feast, nor ought the goal of cancelers to be to cast offenders into the outer darkness. This sort of ultimate exclusion is not up to us. Thank you.